After a quiet proposal, he and Emily plan a small wedding built on calm. Until his mother demands Aaron, the brother who slept with his college girlfriend, be invited. Interventions follow, and a tense lakeside meeting forces him to defend his boundaries or surrender his hard-won peace. When Emily said yes to my proposal, I felt a kind of quiet relief that I hadn't known I was searching for. We had been together for 4 years, and she had the steady warmth that made the noise in my head go still. She never pushed too hard or judged too fast. She listened and she laughed at the right moments, and she understood that I liked my peace. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I could finally stop waiting for something bad to happen. The funny thing about peace, though, is that it rarely lasts when family finds out about it. My mom is a good person in the broad sense of the word, but she is also the kind of person who cannot sit still when other people are upset. She will bend, twist, and rearrange everyone's feelings until she finds a version of reality that looks calm enough to photograph. She calls that harmony. I call it exhaustion. When Emily and I started planning our wedding, I wanted it small and simple. I pictured a quiet outdoor venue with about 80 people and no unnecessary speeches. We wanted to focus on the day, not the performance. It was supposed to be a clean start after a decade of learning what not to let into my life. I had no idea that my mother would see that plan as an invitation to open every door I had carefully shut. The trouble started when she asked whether I planned to invite my brother Aaron. Now that was a name I had not spoken out loud for years. Aaron and I grew up close in the way most brothers do, sharing rooms and fights and secrets and unspoken rivalries. But the bond broke during my senior year of college when I found out that he had been sleeping with my girlfriend at the time. Her name was Rachel. She was my first real love and the one I thought would still be around when I graduated. We had been together for 3 years and were already talking about moving in together after school. I was naive enough to think that loyalty was automatic when you loved someone. When the truth came out, it didn't come with drama or confession. It came through a mutual friend who saw them together off campus one weekend. I confronted Rachel first. She cried, then admitted it right away. The part that still hurts is that she told me Aaron said I would never find out. He had laughed about it, apparently called it harmless. I broke up with her that same day and drove home to face him. I don't even remember what I said to him, but I remember how calm he was. He didn't deny it and he didn't apologize. He just said something like, maybe she was never really that into you anyway. That line stuck in my head like a splinter, and it stayed there for years. I cut him off completely after that. No calls, no texts, no chance of reconciliation. I moved cities after graduation and made sure he didn't know where. My mom called it a silly feud and spent months trying to convince me to forgive him. She said brothers fight all the time and that I shouldn't let one mistake destroy the family. One mistake. That was her favorite phrase. She treated betrayal like it was a scraped knee instead of a broken rib. Over the years, she got creative with her guilt trips. She would send messages on holidays about how lonely Aaron looked in family photos or how I was missing out on the chance to heal. At some point, I stopped responding. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was fatigue. I didn't hate Aaron, but I didn't trust him either, and I didn't need to keep reopening that wound just to make everyone else comfortable. When I told my mom that Emily and I were engaged, she was thrilled for about 10 minutes before she started her campaign. The first question out of her mouth was whether Aaron would be invited. I told her no. The silence that followed was long enough that I could almost hear her frown through the phone. Then came the sigh, the familiar theatrical kind she uses before a long lecture. She said, "You can't do that, he's your brother," as if that fact alone erased everything he had done. I explained as gently as I could that I didn't want him there, that the wedding was supposed to be peaceful, that having him anywhere near it would ruin that for me. She didn't like my answer. Within a week, the calls started. First her, then an aunt, then a cousin. Each one of them had their version of the same message. Family is forever. Don't make your mother choose sides. What will people think if your brother isn't there? I kept my tone calm but firm. I wasn't changing my mind. Then one afternoon my mother dropped the line that changed the entire dynamic. She said, "If Aaron isn't invited, then I won't come either." That one hit harder than I expected. I love my mom even if she drives me insane, and the thought of her skipping my wedding sat heavy on me. But at the same time I knew exactly what would happen if I gave in. Aaron would walk in that day acting like nothing had ever happened, and I would spend the entire ceremony pretending not to feel sick every time I saw him. I couldn't do that to myself or to Emily. So I told Mom I would think about it just to buy some breathing room. Instead of sending Aaron an invitation, I sent him a letter. I wrote that I didn't hate him, but I didn't trust him. That the wedding was about love and peace, and I didn't want old wounds showing up dressed in suits, pretending they were healed. I wrote that he had made his choices and I had made mine, and that this wasn't revenge. It was simply me protecting what little peace I had left. I mailed that letter on a Friday. By Sunday my phone was full of messages from him. Some angry, some sarcastic, all of them missing the point. He said I was being dramatic, that I needed to grow up, that it was time to move on. My mom called that night crying, saying he was devastated and that I had torn the family apart. I hung up before she could finish. I thought I would feel guilty afterward, but instead I felt strangely light, like I had finally stopped carrying something heavy I had long forgotten was still on my back. Then a week later the invitations went out and the real storm began. When the invitations were finally sent out, I felt like I could breathe again. Every name on that list belonged to someone who cared about us. Friends who had seen Emily and me grow together, and relatives who didn't treat my boundaries like they were optional. It was supposed to be the start of something simple and happy. For about 3 days it was. Then my mother called again, and I knew the peace wouldn't last. Her tone was polite at first, which was always the warning sign. She said she'd been thinking about things, and that she hoped I would reconsider the invitation for Aaron. I told her my decision hadn't changed. That was all it took for the conversation to slide downhill. She told me I was being cruel, that I was letting a youthful mistake dictate my adult life. She said Aaron regretted what happened, even though I had never heard that from him. When I reminded her that he had never apologized, she said maybe he was too ashamed to say it out loud. I almost laughed at that. The only thing Aaron had ever felt ashamed of was getting caught. The calls came every few days after that. Sometimes from Mom, sometimes from other relatives, repeating her words almost word for word. They tried everything from guilt to reason to subtle insults. I learned to let the phone ring until it stopped. Emily saw what it was doing to me, and she told me that if it came to it, she would marry me anywhere, even if it meant just the two of us in a courthouse. I believed her. That was the thing about her, she didn't push, she just anchored me when I started drifting too far. A few weeks before the wedding, my mom tried one last move. She said Aaron had been talking about making amends and wanted to meet for coffee. I told her that was not going to happen. She said fine, then maybe she would invite him to the wedding herself, since it was her family too. I told her if she did that, I would ask the staff at the venue to turn him away at the door. The silence that followed was sharp and cold. Then she hung up. For 2 weeks she didn't call at all. It was the quietest stretch of the entire engagement, and even though part of me missed her voice, another part of me enjoyed the quiet too much to break it. During that time, Emily and I focused on the final details. We met with the caterer again to adjust the menu, picked up her dress and my suit, and walked through the venue one more time to plan where everyone would sit. It was all coming together in a way that felt almost unreal. Then 3 days before the wedding, I got an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with Aaron's handwriting on it. He said Mom had told him about the letter I sent and that he wanted to clear the air. He wrote that he didn't regret what happened with Rachel, because according to him it had helped me grow up. He said I was always too sensitive, too attached, and that losing her was good for me. He ended the note by saying he hoped the wedding went well and that maybe one day I'd finally understand. There was no apology, no ownership, just that familiar smug tone. I didn't even show it to Emily. I folded the paper back up and tossed it into the trash. That night Mom called again. She asked if I had read his letter. I asked how she knew about it. She admitted she had given him my address. I told her that was out of line. She said she was only trying to help. She didn't understand why I couldn't just forgive and forget and start fresh. I told her forgiveness wasn't a button I could press just because she didn't like the mess. Then she started crying again, saying she didn't know how she could show her face at the wedding, knowing one of her sons would be missing. I told her that was her choice and that I wouldn't beg her to come. When I hung up, I felt hollow. It wasn't anger anymore, just this dull ache somewhere behind my ribs. Emily sat beside me quietly while I stared at the phone like it might ring again. She asked me if I wanted to postpone the wedding until things calmed down. I told her no because if I waited for my family to be calm, I'd never do anything in my life. The wedding day came faster than I expected. The morning light was bright and clean, and the venue smelled faintly of pine and fresh flowers. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another guilt message, but nothing came. When Mom arrived, she looked beautiful and distant. She hugged me tightly but said almost nothing. I knew she was upset, but at least she was there. That was enough for me. The ceremony went perfectly. Emily walked down the aisle smiling in that calm way of hers, and I felt the sudden weight lift off me. For a few minutes, everything felt exactly how it was supposed to. No noise, no guilt, no ghosts from the past. Just her and me and the sound of wind in the trees. Afterward, when we were taking photos, I caught a glimpse of Mom standing alone near the edge of the crowd, staring at her phone. I knew who she was texting. I didn't say anything. There was no point. I wasn't going to let that moment be stolen. By the time the sun went down and the lights came on, the weight I had carried for years finally started to dissolve. The speeches were short and sweet, and the music was just right. I saw Mom laugh once or twice, even though I knew she was still torn inside. I tried to take that as a good sign. When the night ended and Emily and I drove away, I thought maybe, just maybe, the storm had passed. But a few days later, the messages started again, and it was clear that the real aftermath was just beginning. The week after the wedding was supposed to be a quiet one, filled with lazy mornings and leftover cake and the simple joy of calling each other husband and wife for the first time. Instead, my phone kept buzzing like a reminder that peace is never free when family is involved. The first message came from my mother saying she hoped I was happy now that I had humiliated her. The second came from Aaron, filled with his usual mix of sarcasm and self-pity. After that, the trickle turned into a stream. Aunts, cousins, distant relatives, I barely remembered each of them sharing their 2 cents about how family should stick together. Emily told me to ignore it, but it was hard. Every time I thought I had finally let go, the guilt would creep back in like water through a crack in a wall. My mother's words hurt the most. She wrote that she had never seen Aaron so broken, and that she couldn't believe her own son would treat his brother like a stranger. She called me cold, she called me selfish, and then she ended the message with the line that always gets me, "You are not the man I raised." I read that part 3 times before deleting it. Emily tried to keep me distracted. She planned small things for us: a hike one day, breakfast at the cafe near the lake another day. She didn't talk about my family unless I brought it up. She just kept steady company, letting me vent when I needed to and keeping quiet when I didn't. But even in those quiet moments, my mother's disappointment hung over me like static. A few days later, I opened my email and saw that she had written again, this time a long letter instead of short jabs. She said she couldn't sleep at night thinking about the division between her sons. She blamed herself for raising us to compete instead of cooperate. Then she pivoted and said that even if Aaron was wrong, I was being cruel by punishing him forever. The letter was filled with half apologies and full guilt trips, the kind that sound like love until you read them twice. I didn't know how to answer. I sat staring at the screen for a long time until Emily walked in and placed a cup of coffee beside me. She asked if I was going to reply, and I said maybe. She told me to be kind but firm, that I owed myself that much. So I typed out something short and calm. I wrote that I loved her, but that I was done having the same argument. That I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, and that I just wanted to live my life without reopening wounds. I pressed send and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, I got a notification from social media. Aaron had posted something vague about how some people never grow up and how betrayal comes in many forms. I wouldn't have cared, except that a few relatives had already commented saying things like "stay strong" and "family first." I didn't need to be a detective to know who he meant. I didn't reply. I just blocked him. My mother called that night angry and crying, saying she couldn't believe I would embarrass the family by making private matters public. I told her I hadn't posted anything. She said that wasn't the point. She said the point was that Aaron was hurting and that I should fix it. I reminded her that Aaron was the one who had broken things years ago. She said I needed to stop living in the past. It was a conversation we had rehearsed for years without ever changing a single word. Eventually, I stopped answering her calls altogether. For a while, she kept leaving voicemails, some tearful, some angry. Then they slowed down until there were none. The silence that followed was painful but also strangely peaceful. Emily and I took a short trip out of town. We rented a small cabin near the woods where there was no phone service and no one knew our names. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking up to the sound of a buzzing phone. I remember sitting outside one morning watching the sun rise through the trees and realizing how much of my life had been spent trying to earn peace from people who didn't want to give it. When we returned home, I thought maybe the tension had cooled down. Then one afternoon, I came home from work to find a small package sitting on the porch. No name, no return address, but the handwriting on the label was familiar. Inside was a photo album filled with pictures from our childhood. Aaron and I playing in the yard, our family vacations, our old dog. Tucked between the pages was a short note that said, "Simply hope this reminds you that blood matters more than pride." I stood there holding that album for a long time. The pictures looked like memories from someone else's life. I could see the smiles, but I couldn't feel them. I slipped the note into a drawer and left the album on a shelf where it wouldn't mock me. That night I told Emily about it, and she listened quietly before saying something that stuck with me. She said, "Peace is not the same as forgiveness. You can forgive someone quietly without ever letting them back into your life." I had never thought about it that way. Maybe she was right. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about inviting pain back to dinner. Maybe it was about acknowledging the past without letting it run the future. For a few weeks things stayed calm again, but I could sense something brewing in the distance. My mother was too quiet. Aaron hadn't posted anything in a while. The air felt like it does before a storm. Then one Sunday morning I got a group text from my mother that made my stomach twist. She said she wanted us all to meet at her house next weekend to talk things out as a family. She called it a healing gathering. She invited me, Aaron, and half a dozen relatives who had already taken his side online. I knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't a healing gathering. It was an ambush. The message about the family meeting sat on my phone like a bad omen. My mother had written it with her usual sweetness, talking about healing and unity, but I knew the tone too well. That sugary language was always the wrapping paper she used for manipulation. I didn't reply right away. I read it 3 times, showed it to Emily, and then stared out the window for a while trying to decide if showing up would be worth the headache. It didn't take long to realize it wouldn't. The idea of sitting across from Aaron, with our relatives pretending to be mediators, felt absurd. I could already picture the setup. My mother teary-eyed in the center, Aaron playing the victim, everyone else nodding along about how life is too short for grudges. No one would talk about what actually happened. They never did. The focus would shift to my stubbornness, as if boundaries were a personality flaw. I texted my mother back that evening. I told her I appreciated the invitation but wouldn't attend. I said it as gently as I could. I wasn't ready, and forcing a reconciliation wouldn't make things better. She called almost immediately, her voice shaky with that familiar mix of disappointment and disbelief. She said I was breaking her heart and accused me of enjoying the distance. I told her I didn't enjoy any of it. I just didn't want to keep reopening wounds. She said she would hold the meeting anyway and that I could show up if I changed my mind. I told her not to expect me. The following weekend, while my family gathered to heal, I took Emily to a park by the lake. We bought sandwiches from a food truck and sat on a bench watching the sunlight ripple on the water. For a few hours it felt like another world. My phone stayed in my pocket the whole time. When I finally checked it later that night, there were 9 missed calls from my mother and 3 from an aunt. I didn't answer. The next morning she called again. Her voice was sharp now, stripped of softness. She said everyone had shown up. Everyone except me. She said Aaron had cried when he talked about how much he missed his brother. I didn't respond. She told me the family was so disappointed in how cold I'd become and that I had embarrassed her in front of everyone. Then she said the line that made me go completely quiet. "I think you're punishing me more than you're punishing him." That one stuck with me. I thought about it all day while pretending to focus on work. Maybe there was some truth to it. I wasn't just angry at Aaron anymore. I was angry at her. For years of pretending his betrayal wasn't serious, for calling it a misunderstanding instead of what it really was, and for making me feel like I was the problem every time I tried to protect myself. That night I told Emily I didn't know how to fix things with my mother. She told me something simple that I couldn't stop thinking about afterward. She said, Maybe you can't fix it because she doesn't see it as broken. Sounded harsh, but it made sense. To my mother, peace meant pretending. To me, peace meant honesty. We were never aiming for the same thing. A few days later, a package arrived at our door. I almost didn't open it because I recognized the handwriting right away. Inside was a small wooden box and a letter from my mother. The letter started kindly, talking about how she missed me and wanted to find a way forward. Then it shifted into the familiar guilt-laced tone. She wrote that Aaron had poured his heart out at the meeting, that he was hurting, that he wanted forgiveness but didn't know how to reach me. She said life was too short and that I needed to remember the bond between brothers. She ended it with a line that felt rehearsed. I just hope you don't regret shutting him out when it's too late. Inside the box was a photo of the three of us, me, Aaron, and Mom, at a family picnic when we were teenagers. I stared at it for a long time. My mother's hand was on both our shoulders. Aaron and I were smiling, but the memory behind that picture was less perfect. That same day, we had fought so badly that I ended up walking home alone. Mom had forced us to pose right after the argument, insisting we smile for the camera. She always wanted the illusion of peace, even if it meant ignoring the truth. That night, I put the photo back in the box and slid it into a drawer. I didn't know what else to do with it. Throwing it away felt cruel, but keeping it out in the open felt dishonest. It belonged somewhere in between, like the rest of this family mess. A week later, Aaron decided to escalate things in his usual fashion. He posted another cryptic message online. Something about some people being too proud to admit when they're wrong. It wasn't subtle. Mutual relatives chimed in again, liking and commenting and offering sympathy. One cousin even messaged me privately to say I should apologize before Mom got too sick from the stress. That made me laugh out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. For days I kept waiting for Mom's next call, but it didn't come. Instead, Emily received a message from her. Polite, careful, trying to sound warm. She said she wanted to drop by for coffee to catch up. Emily, always graceful, said yes. I didn't mind. I figured maybe this time Mom would come without an agenda. She didn't. She arrived smiling, holding a bag of pastries, and spent the first 10 minutes talking about the weather. Then she brought up Aaron. She said he had been struggling with depression, that he missed me, and that the whole family was suffering because of my stubbornness. Emily stayed quiet while I listened. When Mom finally paused, I told her I understood she was worried, but that this conversation wasn't helping. I said I couldn't undo the past and that pretending everything was fine wouldn't make it true. Her face fell, and she looked at me like I had just failed some invisible test. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. Then she stood up, said she hoped I'd come to my senses soon, and walked out without finishing her coffee. When the door closed, Emily exhaled slowly and said, "That was rough." I nodded. But deep down, I felt strangely calm. For once, I hadn't caved. Later that night, I sat in the dark living room thinking about all the years I'd spent trying to please people who confused forgiveness with surrender. I realized I didn't need to keep proving I was a good son or a good brother. I just needed to be a decent man who could live with himself. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something else was coming. My mother had never been one to give up easily. And if I knew her at all, I knew that when words stopped working, she would find another way to get her point across. It turned out I was right about my mother not being finished. The silence that followed her visit lasted just long enough for me to start relaxing. For a week or so, the house felt unusually peaceful. Emily and I went back to our routines, making dinner together after work, watching shows in the evenings, sometimes sitting out on the porch when the air turned cool. It almost felt normal. Then, on a Thursday evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Laura, who I hadn't spoken to in years. It said simply, "Hey, just wanted to check if you're coming to your mom's get-together this weekend." I stared at the message for a full minute before replying. "What get-together?" Laura sent back a cheerful response saying my mom had invited everyone for a casual family dinner to celebrate my wedding and that she was glad I was finally reconciling with Aaron. My stomach dropped. I called my mother immediately, but she didn't pick up. I tried again twice more. Nothing. When I told Emily, she put down her cup of tea and said she had a bad feeling. I laughed a little, but it was hollow. By the next morning I had confirmation. My mother had sent out invitations to half the extended family for a dinner that weekend and told everyone that Aaron and I would both be there to make peace. She even sent a group message about how family bonds always win in the end. Couldn't believe it. I called her again that night. This time she answered on the third ring, sounding almost too calm. I asked why she told everyone I'd be there. She said she was trying to help me save face and that it would look bad if I refused to come after she'd gone to all this effort. I asked if Aaron knew about this. She said of course and that he was thrilled. The word thrilled made me clench my jaw. I told her in a steady voice that I wasn't coming. She said if I refused she'd tell everyone I was being cruel and ungrateful. I said she could tell them whatever she wanted and hung up. The next 2 days were tense. My phone buzzed almost non-stop with messages from relatives trying to guilt me into attending. I ignored them all. On Saturday night, when the dinner actually happened, I took Emily out for burgers and milkshakes instead. We ate at a small diner off the highway where no one knew who we were. For a couple of hours, I forgot about the chaos. Then, while we were driving home, my phone started lighting up again. This time, it wasn't guilt messages. It was outrage. Apparently, my mother had turned the dinner into a full-blown intervention. From what one of my cousins later told me, she stood up halfway through the meal and gave a long emotional speech about family love and forgiveness. Aaron joined in talking about how hard it had been living without his brother's support. By the end of it, several relatives were crying and saying I had broken my mother's heart. Someone even suggested that maybe I was holding a grudge because I was jealous of Aaron's success. I guess it was easier for them to make up a story than face the truth. By Sunday morning, I had messages calling me heartless. One even said I owed Aaron an apology for embarrassing him. It was absurd. I sat there reading the texts while Emily made breakfast quietly in the kitchen. I think she saw my face and decided not to ask. Instead, she set a plate of toast in front of me and said only one sentence. "You don't owe them your peace." That line hit harder than she probably realized. It became something I repeated to myself through the following days when the guilt tried to crawl back in. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about how far my mother had gone to force a picture of harmony that didn't exist. A few days later, a small envelope arrived in the mail addressed in her handwriting. Inside was a card with a picture of 2 doves and the words "Reconciliation Dinner" printed across the front. Underneath, she had written, "We missed you and hope you find it in your heart to forgive before it's too late." There was a smaller piece of paper tucked inside with another note from Aaron. It said he was sorry for what happened at the dinner and that he hadn't realized I'd refused to come. Then he added something that made my hands tremble slightly. He wrote that he wanted to meet alone. No one else. Just us. He said he would wait at our old neighborhood park next Saturday morning if I changed my mind. For the next few days, I thought about that note more than I wanted to admit. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part was curious. What if he really was trying to apologize? What if he finally understood the damage he caused? Emily told me not to go if it would reopen wounds, but she said she'd support me either way. I spent the rest of the week torn between 2 instincts: protect my peace or test my hope. On Saturday morning, I woke up early and sat in the car for a long time staring at the steering wheel. The air outside was heavy with early fog. I almost turned the key and drove off to grab coffee instead. Then, for reasons I still can't explain, I drove to the park. When I arrived, I saw him sitting on the same bench where we used to feed ducks as kids. He looked older than I remembered, a little heavier, maybe a little more tired. For a second, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked up when he saw me and smiled, that same crooked smile I remembered from before everything went wrong. I didn't sit right away. I stood there a few feet away, waiting for him to speak first. He looked nervous, and for the first time in years, he didn't have that smug air about him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. He said he wanted to clear the air once and for all. I waited for the words I'd never heard from him before: an apology, a simple acknowledgement of what he had done. But instead he said something that made my stomach twist. He said Mom had told him I'd been lying about what happened all those years ago. That according to her, I had exaggerated everything just to make him look bad. For a moment I couldn't even breathe. The words hit me like a slap that I never saw coming. I stood there staring at him, trying to decide whether I had misheard, but his face told me everything. He wasn't confused or uncertain. He actually believed it. He thought our mother had told him the truth and that I had been the one twisting the story for years. I felt this slow heat crawl up my neck and settle behind my eyes. I told him that wasn't true, and he shook his head like he was talking to a stubborn child. He said Mom told him that Rachel had come on to him first and that he only told her the truth later out of guilt. He said the whole thing had been a misunderstanding that I blew out of proportion because I was insecure. In that moment I understood why my mother had been so quiet lately. She had rewritten history and handed him a version that made her comfortable. She couldn't stand having one son look like the villain, so she built a softer story where both of us shared the blame. She had been doing it all along, turning every argument, every betrayal, every hurt feeling into a tale of equal fault. I told Aaron I didn't come there to argue about what Mom believed. I told him I came because I thought he wanted to take responsibility for once. He laughed softly and said he had nothing to take responsibility for. He said I'd spent years punishing everyone for my own mistakes and that maybe it was time to grow up. Then he added that Mom was sick with worry and that if anything happened to her it would be on me. That was the last thing he said before standing up, brushing off his hands, and walking away like he'd won something. I sat down on that cold metal bench after he left and felt this hollow quiet settle in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something heavier, something that didn't even have a name. It was the feeling of finally realizing that some people will rewrite your pain until it fits their comfort. And there's nothing you can do to stop them. When I got home, Emily was sitting on the couch reading. She looked up and saw my face and didn't ask what happened. She just put the book down and waited until I finally spoke. I told her everything word for word. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said she was sorry and that maybe now I could stop expecting an apology that was never going to come. I nodded because I knew she was right, but knowing didn't make it easier. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about how easily stories can change once they pass through enough people. I thought about how my mother would tell her friends and relatives that she had tried everything to fix things, but I had refused. I thought about how Aaron would play the role of the misunderstood brother. And I thought about how no one would ever know the full truth except me. The next morning I called my mother. When she answered, she sounded almost cheerful, like nothing had happened. I told her I knew what she'd said to Aaron. She went quiet for a second, then sighed and said she only told him her version to keep the peace. She said she was tired of the hostility and that she thought softening the story might help him move on. I asked her if she understood that what she'd done wasn't peacekeeping, it was lying. She said I was being dramatic again. That word always made me feel like I was 17 all over again, standing in the kitchen trying to explain why betrayal mattered. I told her I loved her, but that I couldn't do this anymore. I said that until she stopped trying to control the narrative, I didn't want to be part of the conversation. She said fine in that tight, clipped voice she used when she felt cornered. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She said I had chosen Emily over my own blood and that one day I'd regret it. Then she hung up. After that call, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at my phone like it might light up again. Didn't. The silence that followed felt different this time. It wasn't the kind that comes before another wave of guilt. It was final. Over the next week, the weight started to lift. I stopped checking social media, stopped waiting for the next crisis. I even started sleeping better. One evening while Emily and I were cooking dinner, I realized how peaceful the house felt. There was no tension, no expectation, no storm brewing in the background. Just the sound of sizzling oil and the smell of garlic in the pan. It struck me how strange it was that peace could feel so unfamiliar at first, like a sound you had forgotten existed. Then 3 weeks later a letter arrived. It was from my mother, but it looked different. Her handwriting was shaky and uneven. Inside was a single page where she wrote that she had been to the doctor and that they'd found something in her lungs. She said it might be nothing, but that it had scared her enough to think about the things she wanted to make right. She didn't ask for forgiveness and she didn't mention Aaron. She just wrote that she hoped I was happy and that she missed hearing my voice. I read that letter 3 times. Emily asked if I was going to call her. I said I didn't know. Part of me wanted to rush to her side the way I used to when she was upset. Another part of me knew that if I went back too soon, we'd fall into the same pattern again. She would cry and promise to change and then slowly twist the story back into something else. For the next few days, I carried that letter in my pocket. At work, at home, even when I went out for a walk, I kept checking it like it might give me an answer. By the end of the week, I decided to drive to her house. I didn't tell Emily. I just left one morning before sunrise. The highway was empty and the sky was turning that faint blue that comes before daylight. When I reached her neighborhood, the streets were quiet. Her house looked the same as always except for the new flowers she'd planted by the porch. I stood at the gate for a long time before walking up the path. Through the window, I saw her sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. For a moment, I saw her not as the mother who tried to control everything, but just as an aging woman who had spent her whole life trying to keep the world from falling apart. I knocked on the door. The sound of my knock must have startled her because she looked up quickly through the glass with this expression that was half surprise and half disbelief. She stood up slowly and opened the door without saying anything. For a few seconds, we just looked at each other. Her hair was grayer than I remembered, and she had that tired look people get when they've been trying too hard for too long. I didn't know whether to hug her or stay where I was. She made the choice for me. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me before I could even speak. Her hands were trembling a little. Inside the house, everything looked the same as when I was a kid, but smaller somehow. The walls still had those old family photos lined in perfect rows like proof that everything had always been fine. She told me to sit down and poured me coffee just like she always did whenever she didn't know where to start. The silence between us was soft, not tense. She finally said she hadn't expected me to come and that she was glad I did. I said I got her letter and wanted to see how she was doing. She told me the doctors had found a small growth in one lung, but that it wasn't as bad as she'd feared. They were running more tests. She smiled as she said it, but her eyes told another story. I didn't push. We sat there for a long while sipping coffee like two people trying to relearn a language they once spoke fluently. Eventually she said she wanted to explain something. She said she knew I was angry about what she told Aaron and that she deserved it. She said she hadn't lied because she wanted to hurt me, but because she couldn't stand watching her sons hate each other. She said she thought that if she softened the story, maybe we could find our way back. Then she said she realized too late that she hadn't been protecting peace at all. She'd been protecting denial. Hearing her say that out loud made something loosen inside me. I didn't forgive her instantly, but I could feel the first small piece of the wall start to crumble. She looked at me for a long time, waiting for me to say something. I told her I understood that she was trying to fix things in her own way, but that it had broken something instead. She nodded and said she knew. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her hand felt light and cool. She said she hoped I'd keep visiting even if Aaron didn't. I asked how he was doing and she said he hadn't come by in weeks. Apparently after I refused to accept his version of events, he started avoiding her too. She said she missed him but that she was tired of chasing both of us. For the first time in years, I saw her let go of control. There was no manipulation, no guilt, just quiet sadness. When I left that afternoon, she walked me to the door and told me she loved me. I said I loved her too. I drove back home through light rain with the windows cracked open and the smell of wet pavement drifting through the car. It felt like something inside me was being rinsed clean, even if only a little. That night, I told Emily everything. She listened the same way she always did, without interrupting, without judging. She asked if I felt better. I said I wasn't sure yet, but I felt lighter. We sat there for a long time afterward with the house quiet except for the sound of the rain. In the weeks that followed, I started calling my mother once a week. We didn't talk about Aaron. We didn't talk about Rachel. We talked about small things like her garden or a new recipe she tried. Sometimes she'd tell me about an old movie she'd watched and ask if I remembered seeing it as a kid. The calls were short but peaceful. And that was enough. Aaron never reached out again. At first I thought I might try to contact him one more time, but then I realized I didn't need to. Some stories don't get closure. Some just fade quietly until they're no longer sharp. He will always be part of my past, but he doesn't have to take up space in my present. I finally made peace with that. A few months later, I got another letter from my mother. This one wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was just a note saying she was doing better and that her latest tests were clear. She said she was thankful we had found our way back to some kind of understanding. At the bottom she wrote that she had been looking through old photo albums and found a picture of me and Aaron when we were little, sitting on the same bench by the lake where we used to feed ducks. She said she had put it away not on the wall but in a box where it could rest without being a reminder. That felt right. After reading that, I sat for a long time thinking about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the silence, the years spent circling the same pain from every angle. I realized peace hadn't come in some grand moment of forgiveness. It had come in small steps, in refusing to reopen old wounds, in choosing calm over chaos, in learning that sometimes walking away is the most honest way to love yourself. Now when I think about Aaron, I don't feel that burn in my chest anymore. Just a dull ache that reminds me I once cared deeply and got hurt deeply and survived both. And when I think about my mother, I feel gratitude and caution in equal measure. I visit her now and then. We talk about ordinary things. We never mention the past directly, but it's there in the quiet understanding between us. I don't know if families ever truly heal or if they just learn to live around the cracks. But what I do know is that I'm no longer living in reaction to other people's choices. I wake up next to Emily each morning, and that's enough proof that peace can exist even after years of noise. Sometimes when I pass by the park, I slow down and look at that old bench. It's empty now most of the time. The ducks still wander near the edge of the water the same way they always did. And every time I see that spot, I feel a strange calm settle over me. I don't think about what was said or what was lost. I just breathe and keep driving, knowing that for the first time in a long time my life finally belongs entirely to me.